Hello again, Jody here. Thank you for joining me in another installment. Or if you're new to my channel, hey, thanks for joining me. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the emergency fund concept, and in particular, talk about like options for the emergency fund. Because sometimes you can't have them, you don't have enough money to have a fund, or sometimes you have a fund, but you're like, should I have it? How much should it be? So I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways to think about the emergency fund. But before that, wow, that was really loud. If you like my content, please do the old like and subscribe dealio. That really helps me out. Appreciate it. And also, I just want to let you know if you follow some of my Quicken content and you like that, I now have paid memberships with YouTube where you can get more advanced Quicken content. And also, there's a tier where you can request I make a certain Quicken video to meet your needs. So check that out if you're interested. All right, on to the video. So emergency funds. The basic, general thinking on the emergency fund is you want to have, 3 to 6 months of cash in a savings account and some kind of account that, where you can't lose the money there for the emergency. That might be losing your job, for a period of time and not losing your income essentially. Could be some kind of health emergency, accident, maybe for you or your immediate family or even for like a parent, whatever the cause may be, you want to have a certain amount of living expenses. Usually people say 3 to 6 months of your monthly living expenses is a common thing. And, it's hard to argue with that idea. Like, of course it'd be great to have this nice patty emergency fund. Why not? But here are the questions that come off of this usually, which is, hey, Joe, I don't have that much money. I don't have 6 months of living expenses. I'm young, or I'm, just getting my act together. I'm trying to save, blah, blah, blah. I just don't have it, so what do you have to say to that? And that's one question. And then the other question is, hey, I have an emergency fund, but like it just sits there in like a low interest account, and I feel like maybe I should have it invested. Like should I have it invested, and is that a bad idea to have your emergency fund invested? But let's talk about like the first part. You don't have enough money saved for an emergency fund, and this is very common, of course. So nothing to feel bummed about. But I would say, what are the alternatives that you could consider for an emergency fund? I think, the most immediate, easy go-to alternative is to have a credit card that, hopefully has a sizable balance. Maybe it's not 6 months of your living expenses, but, generally you can get a credit card with, 10, 20, $30,000 pretty easily, and just don't use it. Just have it there in case of emergency. I mean, eventually, if you never use it, they'll be like, "Hey, you got to charge. You got to do a couple charges, or we're gonna close the card." So in that case, maybe you use it, but it's really not in your cycle of spending, and it's just there for the emergency. That is like the easiest, quickest way to have an emergency fund. Now, if you have, if you happen to own a house, I would say you would want to substitute having a HELOC or a home equity line of credit in place of a credit card. Why? Because if you have the emergency and you need to use the credit, a HELOC is a secured debt, so it affects your credit report significantly less than having a large, balance on a credit card, which is an unsecured debt. Also, the home equity line of credit interest rate is going to be significantly less than the credit card. Like if you went out today and got a HELOC versus a credit card, the interest would be 50 to 60% less than the credit card. Lastly, the interest on the HELOC is tax deductible, right? So you thereby reduce the overall cost of the interest through the tax deduction. So that's an option as well. If you don't own a house, but you have a 401k that you can take a loan off of, that would be somewhere you might look to, have emergency funds. Now, I don't like to do that because I don't like to cannibalize, your savings. But at the end of the day, your finances are one big holistic picture. So if you have money in your 401k, but then you have a bunch of money in a credit card debt, the net result of that is really what you have saved. However, getting money in these, retirement accounts where they're growing, with some beneficial tax treatment, they're also protected from bankruptcies and other lawsuits. it's just good to just be putting money in there. I guess you could say the pay yourself first concept as best you can. I generally don't say put money in retirement accounts versus pay off high interest rate credit cards. But in this case, if it's an emergency, I might opt for the credit card first. But if you don't have access to that and you need money, you can take a loan off your 401k, and that is a distinct difference than taking money out of your 401k, which would trigger tax consequences and penalties. You could take a loan off it penalty free. Now, the thing about the loan is that you have to liquidate what's in the account because you actually take the money, but you take it out in this loan concept. And what you've done is you've taken the investment that your 401k dollars are in, and you've made that investment a note to yourself. So now you're paying back the note on a certain schedule, and you're paying interest to yourself. That's how this works. But you keep the interest. Some people say that the sort of unspoken downside of that is that you're putting after-tax money into a pre-tax account and not getting the benefit of it because you're putting in it as interest. But if you're paying yourself interest versus paying the credit card company twice the amount of interest, well, it's a net savings. So I say consider that for sure. You could consider a personal loan as well, but the problem with the personal loan is when you're having the emergency, you don't necessarily have the time to go get the loan. So you need to have your emergency funds or emergency credit available to you on extremely short notice. It's something you have to set up in advance. So a personal loan isn't really going to help you there. However, maybe after you use your credit card, and if you can't pay it down or whatever, you might consider a personal loan as a way to refinance the higher interest rate credit card debt and maybe get a lower interest rate or longer term or something like that. Personal loans are not all that different from credit cards because they're unsecured debt, so oftentimes you can't get a significantly better rate on a personal loan. You probably would then potentially consider, refinance with a HELOC or refi out of your house if you have a house, but in that case, you would have just used the HELOC in the first place. Borrowing from friends and family potentially is like a last resort. I don't think it's never a good idea to borrow money from friends and family. I mean, I don't know. It depends on your family and how close you are and how much they love you. And if you can't pay and don't pay, is it going to ruin your relationship or not? But certainly don't borrow from friends. But if you have family members that have the money and it doesn't hurt them in any way, if you can't pay or don't pay, and they're not going to hate you, maybe consider that. But I would always consider that a last option. If you can borrow from a bank, maybe do that. I'd save the money from family as a way to get a down payment on a house or something like that. Reserve that possibility for that. But again, if it's a complete and total emergency and you have no other means of money and you don't have the credit and you don't have the emergency fund saved, then hey, if you can solve your problem with a helping hand from a loving family member, I assume more a parent or a sibling, and they don't mind, then hey, do it. But I would really think about do they have the money to really do this for you or not? Don't put them in a strained financial situation if you don't have to, So those are the thoughts on if you don't have an emergency fund. Now, on to the question of you have an emergency fund, but should you keep it an emergency fund not invested? My thoughts on this is that if you have the emergency fund and then you have a backup source of emergency funds like the credit card, like a home equity line of credit, like the 401k that you can possibly take a loan off of, then I wouldn't keep the money in the emergency fund not returning a good return. Like if you had $50,000 or $60,000 and it's just getting 2 or 3% a year, where it could be maybe getting 7 to 10 or 15 in the market, for your long-term planning, that's a lot of money to lose just to have cash available. So I would think of it as have the money invested. Now, of course, the downside to having it invested is what if the market's down and then you need to go sell it and stuff like that. That's why you have the backup, source, the credit or HELOC or whatever. You can solve the immediate problem with the backup source and then potentially liquidate, the investments to pay down that source of credit that you used. I think this, theory could holes could be poked in this by many people. It's definitely a little bit riskier in terms of like, racking up debt, and then you can't sell the investments for a year or two, whatever. I don't think it's going to ever be longer than a year or two, before you would be able to liquidate those investments at a gain and, pay down the debt. But the question is, did you make more in the investment than you paid in interest? It depends what you're using. But you also got to keep in mind that, people have emergency funds for a decade and then nothing happens. You know what I mean? So if you add up all the time that nothing happened and that money was invested and it made a lot more money, and then you got to suffer the cost of some interest for a year, you still net out ahead. So, it's a little bit of that kind of risk. So those are my thoughts on the emergency fund. I think I'm maybe a little contrarian on the topic, but that's how I feel. I'll talk to you later.